Picture this. It is October 14th, 1983, 6:48 a.m. The house is submerged in a heavy, muffled silence, the kind that only exists when the adults are dead to the world, sleeping off a long work week. The hallway is dark, but you know the terrain by heart. You creep across the cold linoleum in footed polyester pajamas, moving with the stealth of a cat burglar to avoid the creaky floorboard near your parents' door. You are 7 years old, and your internal clock has fired you awake with a precision that school days never command. This wasn't just a habit, it was a tactical operation, a race against the sun to claim the territory of the living room floor before the real world woke up and ruined the magic with talk of lawn mowing, grocery runs, or homework. This wasn't merely watching television, it was the only religion a kid in the 20th century truly practiced. For the next 5 hours, the world didn't belong to the president, or the teachers, or your dad. It belonged to you, a bowl of red dye number 40, and the glowing box in the corner. The ritual began in the kitchen. You didn't dare turn on the overhead light. The dim gray glow from the window was enough. You reached for the cupboard, bypassing the bran flakes and the oatmeal, the sad beige food of adulthood, and went straight for the good stuff. The box was brightly colored, a beacon of cardboard promise. Maybe it was Captain Crunch, capable of shredding the roof of your mouth with the efficiency of sandpaper or Fruit Loops, smelling vaguely of lemons and heavy chemical sweetness. You poured the milk, whole milk, thick and creamy, and listened to the snap, crackle, pop echoing in the quiet kitchen. Carrying the bowl like a holy chalice, you migrated to the living room. The air here smelled of stale cigarette smoke, trapped in the curtains, and the faint, dusty scent of the shag carpet. Then came the machine. The television set in the late 70s and early 80s wasn't a sleek black mirror. It was furniture. A massive wooden console that weighed as much as a small car, sitting directly on the floor. You reached out and turned the heavy clicking dial. Click, 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 U, H, F, V, H, F. Then, you pulled the knob to power it on. There was a physical sensation to it. You could feel the static electricity on the screen, a fuzzy charge that would make the hair on your arm stand up if you got too close. A high-pitched whine, barely audible to anyone over 30, pierced the air as the cathode ray tube warmed up. The image didn't just appear, it bloomed, a dot of light expanding into a technicolor universe. For the next 4 hours, you were plugged into a collective consciousness, shared by 30 million other children across the continent. There were no streaming services, no on-demand, no pause buttons. You were at the mercy of the big three: ABC, CBS, and NBC. They were the gatekeepers, and on Saturday mornings, they were engaged in a ruthless war for your eyeballs. The lineup was a chaotic mix of recycled vaudeville and blatant commercialism. In the 70s, it was the era of the mystery solvers, Scooby-Doo, and its endless clones like Jabberjaw or Speed Buggy. The animation was limited, the backgrounds were looped, and the voice tracks sometimes fell out of sync with the lip movements, but you didn't care. It was hypnotic. By the time the 80s roared in, the tone shifted from mystery to muscle. This was the era of the 30-minute toy commercial. You sat cross-legged on the floor, spooning soggy, neon-colored sugar into your mouth, watching He-Man and the Masters of the Universe or the Transformers. These weren't just stories, they were instructions on what to ask for at Christmas. The line between the program and the commercials was non-existent. 1 minute, Optimus Prime was fighting Decepticons in the show. The next minute, a breathless announcer was telling you that the Optimus Prime action figure was available at Sears for $12.99. Batteries not included. The sensory experience was overwhelming. The volume was always just a little too loud, a frantic wall of sound composed of synthesizer soundtracks, laser blasts, and high-speed dialogue. The colors were oversaturated, bleeding slightly at the edges of the screen due to poor reception. If the picture went fuzzy, you became the technician, adjusting the rabbit ears antenna, twisting aluminum foil around the tips until the Smurfs looked blue again instead of purple. There was a frantic scarcity to it all. If you slept in until 10 a.m., you missed the good shows. If you had to use the bathroom during Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, you held it. There was no rewinding. If you missed the episode where the Thundercats finally beat Mum-Ra, you missed it forever, or at least until summer reruns. This scarcity bred a deep, intense focus. You weren't binge-watching in the background while looking at a phone. You were staring into that glass eye, absorbing every frame. It was a sanctuary of unsupervised bliss. Parents in the 1980s generally practiced a benign neglect style of child-rearing on weekends. As long as the TV was on and nothing was burning, you were left alone. For those few hours, the living room was a sovereign nation. The outside world, the Cold War, the inflation, the gas prices, didn't exist. There was only the glow, the sugar rush, and the absolute certainty that Saturday was the best day of the week. But even then, unbeknownst to the millions of kids vibrating with energy on their living room floors, the gears of change were already grinding. The corporate hunger that had built this Technicolor cathedral was about to run headfirst into a wall of concerned parents, government regulators, and a technological shift that would shatter the monolith of the Big Three forever. The sugar crash was coming. The 1990s arrived not with a whimper, but with a guitar riff. If the 80s were about generic heroes selling plastic robots, the early 90s were about attitude. The colors got neon brighter, the lines got sharper, and the stakes felt higher. You weren't just watching cartoons, you were witnessing events. When the X-Men animated series premiered in 1992, with its heavy, dramatic synthesizer intro and serialized storytelling, it felt like the medium had grown up with you. But look closer at the screen. Something was changing in the margins. While millions of kids were screaming "Cowabunga" along with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, a quiet war was being waged in Washington, D.C. that would dismantle the Saturday morning kingdom brick by brick. For decades, parental advocacy groups, most notably Action for Children's Television, ACT, had been lobbying Congress, arguing that the 30-minute toy commercials of the 80s were manipulative and that broadcasters had a moral obligation to serve the public interest, not just Mattel and Hasbro. In 1990, the hammer dropped. Congress passed the Children's Television Act, CTA. It sounded boring, bureaucratic, and distant, but for the kids sitting on the living room rug, the impact was immediate. Suddenly, the Wild West of animation was fenced in. The government mandated a cap on commercial minutes, 10.5 minutes per hour on weekends. But the real killer was the E/I requirement. Networks were legally forced to air content deemed educational and informational. The broadcasters scrambled. They didn't want to cancel their profitable cartoons, so they tried to retrofit them. You started seeing bizarre moral lessons shoehorned into action shows. Even worse, the E/I logo, a little icon shaped like a school bell or a globe, began appearing in the corner of the screen like a watermark of doom. It was the visual equivalent of your mom walking into a party and turning down the music. The anarchic, sugar-fueled joy was being diluted by the one thing Saturday mornings were supposed to escape: school. Simultaneously, a technological predator entered the living room. It sat on top of the TV, a sleek black box with red digital numbers: cable. In the 70s and 80s, cartoons were special because they were scarce. They were a limited resource. But by the mid-90s, cable penetration had hit critical mass. Channels like Nickelodeon and the fledgling Cartoon Network were doing the unthinkable. They were airing cartoons on Tuesday afternoons, on Thursday nights, all day long. The scarcity value evaporated. Why wake up at 7 a.m. on a Saturday to watch a fuzzy broadcast signal when you could tune into Nickelodeon at 4 p.m. on a Wednesday and get high-quality, creator-driven shows like Rugrats or Doug? The ritual of the Saturday morning was being cannibalized by the convenience of the everyday binge. It was like eating birthday cake for every meal. The sugar was still there, but the occasion was gone. The big three networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, looked at the math and realized the game was up. They were fighting a two-front war: regulators breathing down their necks demanding educational content, and cable channels stealing their audience with 24/7 programming. Furthermore, the demographics of America were shifting. Advertisers realized that while kids bought toys, their parents bought cars, insurance, and prescription drugs. The networks looked at the Saturday morning slot and saw a financial black hole. Why spend millions licensing Batman when you could air a cheap, in-house news program called The Saturday Today Show and sell ad space to Ford and Pfizer? The dominoes began to fall. NBC was the first traitor. In 1992, they abandoned the cartoon block entirely for news and live-action teen sitcoms like Saved by the Bell. It was a brilliant business move, but a cultural dagger. Shows about high schoolers dealing with caffeine pill addictions were captivating, sure, but they weren't cartoons. The fantasy was being replaced by teenage reality. CBS followed suit in the late 90s. The once mighty lineup that hosted Garfield and the Muppet Babies was replaced by the CBS Saturday Morning News. The silence in the living room was deafening. Where there used to be exploding coyotes and transforming robots, there were now weathermen in suits pointing at cold fronts over the Midwest. By the time the new millennium turned, the ritual was on life support. The final nail in the coffin wasn't a villain, but a format change. In 2004, The Fox network sold its Saturday time slot to 4Kids Entertainment, a syndication block. ABC eventually gave up and filled the time with Litton's Weekend Adventure, a block of hyper-sanitized live-action educational programs about wildlife and oceanography that adhered strictly to government mandates. The static had cleared, but the signal was gone. The Saturday morning block didn't die in a blaze of glory. It was regulated, negotiated, and prioritized out of existence. The specific time-locked joy of the 7 a.m. wake-up call faded into history, replaced by a world where everything is available, always, forever. We live in a golden age of access now. A child today can summon any episode of SpongeBob or Bluey on an iPad in the backseat of a car, at a restaurant, or in bed at midnight. We have gained infinite choice and lost the tyranny of the schedule, but we also lost the shared synchronization of a generation. There was something profound about knowing that millions of other kids were watching the exact same thing, at the exact same moment, eating the exact same sugary cereal. We lost the anticipation, the sweet, agonizing wait for the weekend. We traded a communal ritual for a personalized playlist, and while the picture is clearer than ever, the magic of the morning hush is gone.